We're doing Redux. How many people read the links that I slacked out yesterday? All right, cool. What do you think of that initial motivation page?
To be honest, I read it. I still didn't really understand anything about Redux.
It sounds promising, or you cannot do it. I don't know.
It sounds promising, so I kind of get the concept, but then I didn't see the different parts of it. How you know you want to transfer all this from React to Redux. So I get some pieces.
Some pieces, but you don't really get it yet, right?
I mean, I think the brain model videos are really good.
Oh, yeah.
There were 5 or 6, and it kind of, I mean, seeing it hands-on. I mean, after doing our project over the last few days, I definitely see what Redux is going to do.
Yes. All right, so today I'm going to try to go over Redux, what it is, which I think some of you kind of get, why we use it. So now I'm going to try to convince you that you need to use it, because most people are going to ask, do I really have to use this? And then I'll try to prove that it's a useful tool for certain types of applications, not all of them. And then I'll provide a bunch of links to how to learn Redux on your own, because even though we're going to cover it in today's lecture in the morning and afternoon, that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more to Redux. There's a lot out there, and that's way more than what we can cover in 2 lectures. So first thing, React. So now that you've been through 3 weeks of React, after having gone through Mod 3, which do you prefer? Using straight vanilla JavaScript or React? React? Does anyone prefer vanilla JavaScript still? Ooh, why?
Just because I like making little interactions and stuff like that. So it's very fun to be able to just push something out there in 15 minutes,
Oh.
React is project based, so you have to it's really for building something like an application, so cool,
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. When you want to do small one-off things, yeah, you're probably not going to use React for that. Why do you still
I don't know if I prefer it, but I feel kind of moving in a direction where it's almost you're asking yourself, am I hindered if I don't know React? You should be asking if I don't know JavaScript, but I know React. I don't know. It's weird. I'd rather know the JavaScript portion well than the React. That's how I feel.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. When you get far enough in React, you realize that React is actually just JavaScript. A lot of what we do is really just the JavaScript concepts just being kicked up to 110% and forcing you to remember everything that you know. Because nothing in React, aside from the whole declarative way of thinking, is different from what you did in Mod 3. They just decided to organize it in a certain way. With React though, what kind of problems did you run into? Most people here seem to prefer React, but it's probably not perfect. What issues have you run into?
Well, we actually ran into some state issues, just weird stuff, when you would hover over the lockout button, it would refresh the entire page, or not really, kind of the canvas would just get cleared. It was weird. So, I mean, clearly what Redux is for, but just stuff managing state. So,
how big was your state by the end? Pretty big or just normal?
It was fairly large, I guess, and it was just impossible at that point to keep track of when things were rendered. That's the hardest part.
So I'm looking at it right now that has 3. It has 3 passive relationships. That are nested inside each other. So abilities have many, floors have many of this, and that is a huge problem because if I render my app and install the floors for each building, so listen to each building, listen to each floor, then if I want to click on the things on the floor and that thing, then I now have asking that data three levels down in the app, and then I want to change it. I either have to ask them three levels up or manipulate it. We're going to fetch at the form and fetch instead of public dates. So like that's a really bad, it's really common also with it fetching database a lot of times. Whereas it'd be better if I could just like obviously render everything and then do my fetch requests like at the end of the process.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's like a real pain in React once you have that type of data structure.
Like I don't even know what the fuck I'm doing right now. Like, I've been looking at the same page and refactoring for weeks. So
That becomes a pain. Anyone else like other things that hasn't been touched on? Like any other pain points in React?
Yeah, I think like a lot of the times if you have multiple components responding to the same state, if you have, for example, like a modal that you can just switch on to change in state, and that would affect another component. Because it's re-rendering things that we want to change.
Okay, so like a lot of these are like sibling
Well,
components,
that's like knock-on effects, yeah.
and then like they kind of like trigger changes in the other ones.
Yeah.
Sibling components. Components. Changes. Yeah, that is something that Redux will help with, especially with like abstracting out the state. So you'll be able to trace that much more easily. Anyone else?
I have problems where I like need different pieces of state that are like kind of related to each other and functionality. They need to be like have different levels so that you can access different instances of the same piece of state. And that can actually be a advantage.
Yeah, that does get tricky. And like it's because you don't want to lift it too high up, otherwise
Yeah.
everything's an app, right?
Well, not even that. Also, just like I need different instances of the same component.
Oh,
And those-
yeah.
And those instances need their own independent state, but it's the same like type of state, I guess.
Yeah. So Redux will help with pretty much all of this. Like, it's not for, I will say, smaller applications. Like there are some times where you build React apps that are very small, and you probably don't run into any of this, right? There are like some of the labs you're probably like, oh, I didn't have any of these problems. But when you got to your project in week 3, probably ran into all of these problems. And this is where Redux helps. So, before we like start going into Redux, I will preface this by saying Redux is like gonna really test your JavaScript knowledge, like really test it, and it's also gonna test your English knowledge. So if you hate English, you might hate Redux to start because it throws a lot of words at you, like a lot. Like this next, so in the lecture notes, I actually have a section for vocabulary because you will learn a lot of words. And these are just English words, but you're probably going to be like, what? Why are they using all of this? And this is just one of those things with Redux. You're going to have to learn a lot of terminology. And you'll get comfortable with it with enough practice, but putting this up front so you don't get scared away. Cool? All right. So, Redux, I'm going to go through these nice slides because someone set this up and I have no design skills. Redux, the state of the app. It's a great pun. I love this. So we're going to go through the problem. We've already covered the problems in React. And then we're going to go through the solution, like what Redux does to fix this. Explain what is Redux, the principles of Redux, because it does have rules. Redux is a design pattern, and with most design patterns, you have rules you follow. Like, what's a design pattern that you've heard of? Factory pattern. Any other ones? Think mod 2. REST is a design pattern because you technically don't have to like post things. You could send other things to the server. People just won't expect it. What's another one in mod 2? MVC. MVC is like the big one we learn, right? Design patterns have rules. We follow those rules so everyone knows the same pattern and knows what to expect. Redux has its own like principles for its own design pattern. And then we'll learn about the flow of Redux.
Is CRUD considered a design pattern, or is that more just like a convention?
CRUD is, yeah, it's an acronym for like create, read, update, right? I wouldn't really call it a design pattern. I would just say it's more of something you do, right? Because like REST is more of the design pattern for CRUD, like how you do CRUD. CRUD is something you just have to do. You can do it in a lot of different ways. It has like no rules for what you do. All right, so the problem, we went through the problem. Lots of state changing. It's in different levels. Sometimes it's really big. Sometimes it's very like connected. And you have your React app. You have like 20 different components. So like a lot of them can be connected to each other in different ways. Like we drew out the component hierarchy, and a lot of times like you see branches everywhere, right? One side might be completely lopsided compared to another. And everything eventually is connected up to app. So if we make a change somewhere, we like send information up, down, like it make changes, things propagate, right? And this is all done through props. So every time we change state, we want to change something else below it, we send props. Our props change, components change. This is all what we did in the first 3 weeks. That gets super complicated once it's very big. And this is where Redux comes in. So what is Redux? It's supposed to be a very small library. Redux itself is actually very small. You can read the source code and you should be able to like understand it. It's a design pattern, and the goal of its design pattern is to make state, like anytime you change state, it's supposed to be predictable. Because like someone brought up like when you made change in state, it could affect all these sibling components, and because state is in different places, you don't know what's going on at some point. Like you can try to console log all you want, you can try to debug all you want, but at some point you're just gonna have a completely crazy hierarchy of components with state everywhere, and you won't know what's happening. Redux will try to make all this predictable. Because this is what we usually see, right? This is like our React app. And we could have state in like multiple places, and when one thing changes and sends a change somewhere else, it can affect things in like 5 other components. And you're like trying to trace all these changes going around, don't know what's happening at some point. Who has experienced this? Yeah. Who has liked dealing with this? With Redux, one of the core concepts of Redux is your state, which you've had in multiple components, is now, most of it is now going to be pulled out into a global store. So this is like the first word you're gonna learn, a store. So English quiz time. What is the definition of a store? It's a container. Any other definitions for a store?
It's a place where you can buy stuff.
A place where you can buy stuff, right? So like, this is why I hate Redux. They use words with like multiple meanings. So it's a container, it's a place where you can buy stuff. You can think of the store as both, kind of. The store is where you're gonna contain your state. Your state is going to live here, and it's going to be outside of your entire component hierarchy. It's going to live somewhere else, and it's global. The thing you can buy is your state. Like this is where you're gonna get your state from. You access it through the store. So it's going to be living outside of it. Anytime you wanna make a change, you go to the store, like you drive to the store, buy something, make a change, and then the store is going to tell everyone who's connected to it what changed. Kind of like going to Amazon, you buy something and its inventory changes, everyone can look at that inventory and go, hey, look, oh, it's out of stock now, something's out of stock.
Isn't it necessary to Redux to go through all that problematic? Because otherwise, why don't we just start learning Redux and start learning React? There's like, benefit of going through the process.
Oh, so like, why do people not start out this way? Because it looks cleaner, right?
Well, it is beneficial. So why do we go through that pain?
Oh.
And land that in the same place?
Well, one, because Redux didn't exist like when React was created. And then two, sometimes like you actually don't want to use Redux because we're gonna go through setting up Redux and you're gonna find that there's a lot of boilerplate. Like there's a lot of setup code that you have to write. And that setup code for small React apps actually doesn't make sense. Because we saw in like our Houdini app, pretty much our app had all of our state. It's the same concept. It was like global. Everything was just here, and our app was like very shallow. So it was very easy to predict changes. This is only going to come into play when you have an app that's like really deep and crazy nested. So we don't teach this to start because none of the labs are like that. Most of React, when you're starting to learn, is not like that. Like none of that is needed. So it just overcomplicate things, and you would have to, one, learn way more terminology. Because when we started learning React, we learned like a lot of different words. Like we didn't know what component was in the beginning. We didn't know what state was. We didn't know what a prop was. We didn't know JSX. So if we had to learn Redux at the start, it would just feel overwhelming. So this is why most people don't start out with Redux. I didn't use Redux until like 6 months into like using React because none of the things I was working on needed it at that point. All right, so this is what it's going to do for us. And the way you can get it to work is if you follow these principles for Redux. One, so it's global, right? So since it's global, it's also going to be your single source of truth. Who remembers single source of truth? Who can give me a definition of single source of truth?
Yes, if you get this relationship between objects, only one of the objects should be responsible for every relationship.
Yes, cool. Who likes single source of truth? Okay, mixed reaction, kind of like this. It's a good thing. So like in Redux, it's a good thing. So we're gonna follow this design pattern. Our state is going to be read-only. So we're gonna drive changes through it through something called a reducer and through dispatching actions. Sounds crazy, but for now, just remember that state is going to be read-only. We're never going to mutate state. And we weren't really mutating state anyway in React. Like I told you to make copies of arrays and objects. You're going to do the same thing. You're not going to like mutate any of that. We're going to do all of our changes through something called a pure function. Who is familiar with the term pure function? Kind of. Who can give me a definition of a pure function?
It has a predictable result if you get the same input, it will produce the same output.
Perfect. So no side effects, one input, always get the same output. Cool? All right, so, and then the last part is there's going to be a unidirectional flow of data. So one change goes in, changes propagate out. That's the only direction things happen. One way, and then everything goes out. There's no more of this. This is all gone. So single source of truth is going to be your state. And it's going to be stored in your store. That's why they call it store. It's stored there. So this slide says the state of your whole application is stored there. I will point out that you can have state still. There are some times when you don't put your state in Redux because it's state where you don't care if it's global. So I'll point that out because it usually gets brought up at some point. Most of your state goes into your store. Doesn't have to be all of it. So you don't have to abandon the concept of having state in individual components. So the store. The store is going to be a special thing we create with two methods, get state and dispatch. Get state gets our state. Is how you access it. Dispatch is how you're going to make changes in it. And there's only ever going to be one store for your app. So before we continue on, I need to start demoing all this. So we're going to jump into code now. So, well, exit this. If you want to install Redux, one, you would probably go to the documentation and install Redux. And then two, because we're using React, you'll realize that this is very useless without going and installing this extra library called React Redux. So Redux can be used with other frameworks, but to use it with React, you also need this second library. So if you go into your app, so you can do this if you want, but if you just want to watch, it's fine. You can do a create React app. We're not going to do anything specific to Houdini yet. So you can do this in just your index.js, because that's where I'm going to make all my changes. So npm install, save, Redux, React Redux. So I'm going to install these two libraries, and we're going to start playing around with Redux so we can see what this store is doing. So I'll let that do its thing. I already have it running. The app is here. The thing we're going to pay attention to is this console log. And all we're going to do is just work inside this index. We're not going to do anything React specific yet. If we were to use Redux, the first thing we want to do is create the store. So we have a store to play around with. To create it, you need to import a function called createStore. So, and this is something that's part of the Redux library, so you import it from Redux. createStore, if we want to use it, is going to let us create a store. And it's going to take in one argument. That one argument is going to be something called a reducer. So before I define what a reducer is, who can give me a definition of the word reducer? Well,
Make something less of itself.
yeah, to make something less of itself. Reducer. So this whole lecture is going to be like an English quiz. I'm going to keep asking you to define words because that's like the best way to like understand why everything's named a certain way. So it's going to make something less of itself. The thing is going to make less of, the thing is going to reduce essentially, is going to be your state. As I said, state is going to live inside your store. Reducer is what's going to change that state. So as we like build this out, I'm going to draw as well. I'm going to delete this. Remember, please someone remind me to put the password back up. So we have a crazy component hierarchy. And now we're doing Redux, which means we're creating some local store. That's going to eventually connect everything. So we're creating a store now. This store, I'm going to tell you, is going to hold our state. This is where state's going to live. We're going to rip it out of all of our components. Some of them may have state in there, but for the most part, everything is going to be global. To create this, we also need something called a reducer. This magical reducer. It's a black box right now. We don't know what it is. But what I will tell you is everything that you need to do to change state goes through this reducer. So we're going to send the change in. It's going to spit out some new state. So change. And it's going to give us a new state at the end. To make the store, we actually need this reducer, so they're connected to each other. They're part of each other. What do you think this reducer is? Like in terms of code. If something goes in and then you get something out, what is this probably? Yes, a function, right? This is a reducer is just a function. So this reducer, we need it to create store, so I'm gonna define it above create store. Otherwise it's gonna crash, just regular JavaScript. So it's going to be a function. To make it simple, I'm going to call it reducer. You can name it whatever you want. Right. I'm telling you that it's going to eventually return state. That's what it's going to return. Whoops. This, if I do this, one is going to crash, right? Because state is not defined. We don't know where this is coming from yet. So reducer is a function, and it's going to get 2 arguments whenever it's used. The first argument is state. And this state, an argument, this is going to be your like previous state, the current state that's there. And you're going to change it. So this is like your previous state. Who remembers previous state from React? Where was this? Oh, it was also in like the component lifecycles. Not in the component lifecycles, even before that. What did you use to change state in regular React?
Couldn't you call it or pass it as an argument in set state, and then you can set the state based off of it? You just still using it?
Yep. So this was actually something you saw if you used this .set state and use that optional like syntax where you have previous state and you had some sort of function that returned new state. This is going to look very similar to reducer. So you can think of this as this. It's the state that you already have currently. It's going to come into the reducer. And you're going to return some newer state. For now, I'm just going to not make a change to it. I'll just return it. The other thing a reducer gets is what needs to change. Kind of like how set state needed to know what to change. Like most of the time, you are writing this .set state. What's count this .state .count plus 1, right? We want to make a change, we have to tell it what to change. This second argument is going to tell it what to change. And by convention, it's just called an action. Right now, we're not going to change anything. We just want to see that this works. So now I should not have any crashes. So fingers crossed. Make sure I didn't forget anything. And cool. No crashes. We've created a store. We haven't done anything useful or interesting with it. Now I'm going to start throwing console logs in here so you can see what's happening. So, one, I'm going to put a log in here to show state in action in reducer. I'm also going to use a console log here to show you what the store itself looks like. That's not state, store. And I'm also going to do a console log here to show what's state currently. So if I do store, and I said there was another method called getState, this will return the state after you've created your store. So before I show you these console logs, what order do you think these console logs are going to be in?
Probably on line 23 and 20. Like jump around and then like 23 and go to the front.
Oh, yeah, everyone's expecting me to trick you right now, right?
Or I guess
You're all
I'd
like,
say-
oh man, something weird's going to happen.
I guess I'd say 23, 24, and then all.
23, 24, and then
And
seven,
then it costs like
and then like 17.
Is that, yeah.
So we have guess 1, which is 23, 24, 17. What's your guess?
I would guess 17, 23, 24.
I'm gonna guess 23, 17, 24.
All right, so we're going to look now and see what happens. You'll see that it logged what was in the reducer. So that was line 17. Then it logged the actual store. So that was line 23. And then state, which is line 24. So there wasn't, like, it actually went in this order. But this function was called at some point before we did these logs, right? The reason why it was called before these logs is because create store is going to take this reducer and actually just run it one time. So the first time you use create store, it's going to try to create your state by running this reducer. And then it'll just continue on. We get to see our store and we can see our state. And we'll see that our store has a get state function. It has that dispatch, which we haven't tried yet. It has these other things on it, which I'm not going to even try to point out yet because it won't make sense. You can replace your reducer at some point. Don't, not right now. And you can also subscribe to things, like the way you did listeners. You can subscribe to things in Redux to listen to things. We will not learn either of these. The only ones we're going to learn are these two. And chances are you're probably never going to use these until way, way, way later anyway. So ignore them for now. Don't get too scared. Our state that we logged is undefined. So I'm telling you that reducer is getting called once when we use create store. At the end, it says our state is undefined. Why is our state undefined?
Not passing in any state.
Yeah, we're not passing in any state. Create store is going to run this reducer once to get our initial state. If you don't pass in anything, and this reducer doesn't like define any defaults, it's just going to be undefined. Because state in here, we'll see, is undefined. It runs some initial action, which is going to be a bunch of gobbledygook, which should be sufficiently like unique for what you're doing with your app that it won't like interfere with what we do later. And the result is we just return the undefined. So that's why our store is initially going to have a state that's undefined. If you want to set this up to have some sort of initial state, and you were just doing it with just this function, how might you do that? How could you default something?
That's for undefined in the reducer, and set it there.
Cool. So if state is undefined, we can return some sort of like initial state, right? So some initial state. So this works. You could do this. This is perfectly fine. There's probably like a much cleaner way of doing this though. Yeah. So anyone remember this syntax? If we make state equal to something like an object, a number, a string, it's going to just be initially that. That's just going to be default. If you don't pass in an argument, because create store won't pass in an argument for state, you can default it this way. You can set your own default using regular JavaScript. The default state for most React stuff was just an empty object, right? So this is how we're going to set it up, as an empty object. I will quickly say that this is going to get ugly fast. Like, eventually, like, if we look at our Houdini app, and we want to default our state to this, right? If we want to default it that way, it would look like this, right? It's like, oh, this is our initial state. And now you have like this crazy ugly bit of code where you're saying, oh, look, state is equal to this on its defaults. Most people do not want to look at code like this. And while it's perfectly valid JavaScript, I will say probably don't do that. And just define a constant called initial state somewhere else outside of it, so your code can look a lot cleaner. For now, our initial state, I'm just going to leave it as empty. But you will probably follow this design pattern just because it keeps your code clean. Cool. So now we have state, we have a store, we can look at it. We want to make changes. If we want to make changes, the thing we have to use is something called dispatch, not dislike, dispatch. It's a method. This method, all it takes is an action. Because I'm telling you that this action is what decides what changes in here. Kind of like what you passed into setState. So, first guess as to what action would be. What do you think we're going to pass in as our argument here? So like, oh, like, so if we want to change something called count, you would pass in like a count, right? Good guess. Anyone else have a different guess? If this were,
I guess it depends on the action. Depends on the action.
Oh, it depends on the action, right? Yeah, so it depends on some action, right? And our action is going to tell us to change something like a count. Even better guess. So this is going to be an action. What is our action, though? What is it going to be? A function? Cool. So guess one is a function. Why a function? Oh, yeah. It has to do something. Cool. Anyone else? Hint. What did we pass into setState?
Attributes to be altered.
Yeah, the attributes to be altered. Kind of like that count, right? So like count. If we want to change, we had to change count. But what did we actually send into setState?
An object.
An object, right? So it wasn't just like count, it was like count 1 or something, right? It was an object. So this is going to look very similar to your setState. Your action is just an object. It's an object of things you want to change. So this is not going to be new. This is going to look exactly like what you were doing in React with setState. This is now your setState. From now on, your setState is now called dispatch. And dispatch in English, what does it mean? Yeah, so a dispatch means to send out. And the thing we're sending out is a change in state. So set state was setting your state. Dispatch is sending out a change to your state. This change in state is your action. Oh, I cannot type. So the action is the change you want to happen in state. Right now, if I dispatch this, no, it's gonna yell at me because I'm not following convention. Fine. Actions by convention have two things. So the thing we dispatch is an action. It's an object with two keys and values. One is a type, so it describes the type of action, and it's going to be in all caps, the type of action. And then something called a payload. What is payload in English?
Jeremy said it's going to be like delivered somewhere.
Something to be delivered. Nice. When we dispatch this, you're going to see we get a new console log from inside our reducer. One, it has our empty state that was initialized. And then it got this action, the exact same thing we just sent in, with the type and the payload. You are allowed to put other things in here because it's just an object. You could be like key, value. And it's going to get that key and value. You can do that, but please don't. Because everyone who uses Redux is only expecting these two. So while this is possible, don't do it. If you want to send something to be delivered, put it all inside your payload. The type is going to describe what is supposed to change. So now that we sent something to our store, we dispatched something to our store, we want to change that state. So I'm going to keep editing this crazy chart. So we have this, we have store and a reducer. The change that we want to make now, the way we do it, is we're going to send in something through dispatch. And the thing we dispatch is an action. A type and a payload. The reducer is going to spit out my new state. I'm going to make it curve. Anyone good at drawing the curlies? Really great. That's 5 years of teaching. 5 years of chalkboard. So you're going to dispatch an action. It's going to go not really to the reducer. It's actually going to go into the store. The store is going to pick up the state, send that along to the reducer with your action. Otherwise, if you went straight to the reducer, you have no state. You would have to give a second argument of state, right? So it's going to actually go into your store. It's going to get the state and send along that action to the reducer. That's the general flow. Going to dispatch to the store. The store is going to get your information, pass it along to the reducer. Out comes a new state. And this new state is actually going to update whatever was in the store. So
that's why the reducer has state and action. It's a state from the store and the action.
yes. And that's why these are there. Now, if we want to make a change in this state, so one, we need something interesting in our state. So what do you want to start changing in here? What should we put in our initial state? All right, simplest thing, I'm gonna make a count of 0. So let's say we're going to increment this counter by 1. Our initial state starts with count 0, right? This is our initial state. We want to send some action to change this counter. How could we do that? So I have state. I want to make state look like this at the end. I eventually want this. And if I keep doing multiple dispatches, I want to go 2, 3, 4, 5. Just some counter. How could I change it?
In the payload, the function that will increment the counter, and when the dispatch gets to the reducer, it'll run that function.
Ooh. Run that function inside of the reducer. That would work. That sounds very complicated though, right? Like, who would want to write code like this?
Or you just increment it.
Yeah, you can just increment it in here. So if I want to just increment that count, how can I increment that count? Right? There's nothing crazy about this. If we do that, first problem, our count. So our state starts at 0 when it was first created. So this is that very first line is from create store. Then we see that our initial state is already at 1 because it went called reducer, incremented it right away, spit it back out. So when we logged it after creating our store, it's now at count 1 already. And then we did it again, and now we're at count 2. So problem 1, how can we not do that like on the initial one? How can we do it only when we dispatch this action?
You have to add the action to your call to the reducer.
Cool. So we have to do something with that action in that reducer, right? What do we need to do with this action?
Check to see if it's the increment action.
Yeah, check to see if it's an increment action. Before I write that, how would you check to see if it's an increment action? An if statement. Cool. What are we comparing? Action.type, right? And what is our increment action? Increment. So I'm now not going to call this type of action. Let's call it something more sensible. Let's call it increment. So if this type is an increment, that's when we're going to increment our state, right? And if I log this after dispatch, you'll see starts at 0, initial state is still 0, cool. We sent in this action, afterwards it spits out 1. So works, great. We can dispatch this same action like multiple times. And it's going to just increment after every one of them. We now like made sure that it only increments when we tell it to, based on the type. And that's what the type is for. The type is supposed to describe the action that's happening, and you do something based on that action only, on that type only. If it was any other type, like if I sent in a dispatch with a different action 2, and I called it decrement, Oh, I didn't log. And I dispatch decrement. You'll see after it, it didn't try to decrement it. It didn't increment it. It didn't decrement it either. Why? Yeah, there's no if statement for it. So if we wanted to add an if statement for decrement, what would we do?
Just copy and paste and change it.
Right? You would just be like, hey, cool, decrement. And it'd be like minus equals 1. And if we do that, cool, we can decrement too. Awesome. If I start adding lots of action types, this is eventually going to look like this, right? Who wants to write code like this? Or is everyone okay with that? That's actually like not terrible, but it's not like great either. If statements are fine.
You do like a switch.
Yep, so eventually your reducer is just going to look like a giant switch statement. So instead of lots of ifs, most people are going to write it as a switch based on that action.type. And all of your cases are going to just be these, right? So it would be like, oh, let's increment break.
The things that you can have like a reducer have like many cases.
Yep.
Is that the thing? Or is that like that?
Now that's normal. It's actually going to be like a million like case statements. And really like your reducer is just a function with like giant switch inside of it. That's all it is. Default, what's probably going to be your default? No change, right? So like nothing.
Based on the tutorials, it returns the
Yep. So this is actually supposed to do this return state here. It's not supposed to do anything. This, we're incrementing and then returning. Not very clean. Also, this is breaking one of our cardinal rules for Redux of not mutating states. So, if I didn't want to mutate state, how can I change this? Like I don't want to change this state object, but I do want to return a new state object with an incremented count. Yeah, copy your initial state. So how do I copy this state object? How can I make a copy of it? Spread. Right? So it's like new state is just this, right? And then instead of incrementing our state directly, we can increment our new state, right? And the thing we want to eventually return now, instead of state, is our new state. So I'm going to comment this out here. Instead of a break, I'm just going to break out by returning. I'm going to return new state. Functionally, nothing changes. So this one's minus. Nothing actually changes in this, right? Like, even though we mutated, nothing like, there was no screaming warning. But Redux doesn't want you to mutate state. This is going to work exactly the same. And if we look at our code, we're going to crash wildly. Oh, who has seen this before? No one? No one's actually seen this? This is like a very annoying error that you run into sometimes. It's because I have let new state here and let new state here. to fix that, you would be like, let new state once, and have new state like this. Not very clean. So slowly I'm cleaning up this code. I'm doing this step by step to do it on purpose. This works. We can increment and decrement now. We're not breaking a rule of mutating state, because state is supposed to be read-only. This though looks crazy ugly. So I'm going to clean this up one more time by commenting this out. The thing I'm going to return is the previous state with only count changed. And the count is now going to be state.count plus 1. Here is going to be something similar, except, whoops, we're going to decrement it. So now we don't need this new state thing. Our reducer looks like this. Works the same, not breaking a rule. I'm going to suddenly get rid of all these comments so it's very clean and I can convince you that it looks nice. All of your reducers are going to look something like this, where you make a copy of the state, change something using that JavaScript syntax trick where if you spread it, any of the keys that are after it, just overwrite it, and then you just return it directly. Any questions about how I like refactored this into this?
So that is mutating the state in an example, or is it
Oh, this one is not,
not? Okay.
because we're making a copy and returning a copy.
Okay.
So that original state never gets touched.
Nice.
Is it like one action per thing? Like, can you like keep adding different changes to, like, if you had more like count or state,
Hmm.
is it like, can you keep like, you should keep like one change
Oh yes. So
each one, or like many?
so you could have like multiple things here that are changing. So like something else becomes new. So you can have lots of changes per action, but your type, to keep your code like cleaner and more sane, it should describe one holistic like action that you want to change. This should, you can think of it as like a function, right? You want to increment something. The only thing that should happen inside of increment is incrementing stuff. And if the thing you want to increment isn't just one thing, it could be other things, that's okay. But if you're like trying to decrement something inside your increment as well, don't mix up, don't like merge your types into that. Don't make a crazy case called increment and decrement, right? Where you return like some increment and decrement. Don't do that, because it's just very confusing to read something like this. It's pure JavaScript right now. None of this is like special. This is just regular JavaScript. So you could do this. Try not to. Everyone follow along so far about how I wrote this reducer? Cool. So take a 5-minute break. We're going to dive deeper into this and define more words. Cool? All right. Oh, yeah.
Is there a reason action copy is always in all caps?
Yeah, I'm surprised no one asked that when I said that. Usually that's when I explain it. I'll explain it now. And I'll explain it again when everyone comes back. It's all caps because it's supposed to be a constant, right? And constants by convention in just programming are just all caps with underscores. That's why. You can actually make your type numbers if you want, or booleans, but most people are going to be like, I don't understand what that means. They'd rather see like a string that describes what's happening. I played Dota back when
Ah.
I used to be custom mod.
Video game.
Yeah. I still play Warcraft.
Yeah. Did you play Warcraft through Dota? Me too. Those were the days.
Yep, those were fun. I played on like a really, really bad yellow computer. So like my lag was something like a second and a half. So I was always trying to guess what people were doing. I just got really good at guessing people and guessing when they would come out and ambush me. And I'd be like, alright, time to run. A lot of people thought I was hacking. They were like, how'd you know I was there? I don't know, it just seemed kind of suspicious that like I saw dots disappear from the screen. So I ran away.
Good times.
It's great. My favorite character was Dom Tinker.
Oh, yeah.
I love putting lines everywhere. It's like, yeah, I have so much lag. I'm not going to be good at using the indicators that require like face-to-face battles. So I'm just going to be sneaking and put bombs everywhere.
Tech use is so great on them.
That is why I actually went into computer science.
Really?
I was like, this game, I wonder why I should be here in college.
Good reason as anything, right?
That's a great reason.
Have you thought about getting help?
Yeah. Like, it's one of the hobbies that I follow. Like, I watch a lot of video and stuff. I've never actually gotten into it. I did one class in after college. Like, I went back for post-bac to learn a few things that like, I didn't take. So I regret not taking. And one of them was like a class.
Did you use a specific engine or the basics?
They were like your previews, whatever. They talk more about like game design and how you like you analyze like how these people like design their games and what lessons you can learn. And then we like I just brainstorm on the game. I just got put into a really like two people that I was in here. This one person like this I just didn't really like I knew who he was. He was always he's a huge procrastinator. So he would do things at the last second, so we all be like, like hit this deadline and we wouldn't know. And I just didn't like that. The other guy was okay, but he was like he was younger than us and he was on the CS theory track. So he was actually really bad at programming. He just knew a lot about theory. And I was like, great. That doesn't help us. That and animation. I like animation. That's what's good. My animation class professor. He knew what he was talking about. Then he had like lots of connections. So he brought in like the lead animator. He brought in like the lead animator from Tangled, like that Disney movie or whatever. Is that Disney?
Yeah, that was Disney.
Yeah, that's Disney. Okay. Yeah, he brought in like the lead animator to talk about like how they did the physics for the hair.
Oh, yeah.
And we were just like, that's crazy. Like I never thought about that being difficult, and then I realized like, oh, that is really hard. I'm like, good God.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was watching the director's commentary for the original Incredibles recently, and they talked about how like the hair was actually like its own physics engine, and like they had to
Right.
like, simulate gusts of wind and stuff to like get it. And it was just like a total crapshoot. I think this might work, and we'll try it.
Right?
It's really fascinating.
Oh yeah, that was a great talk. That guy came in. Most of us were like, oh yeah, we're learning animation. Then we were like, oh wow, hair itself is its own like physics engine. It's like it has its own rules for everything.
Is there like some of the basic setup for Redux is essentially always the same, right? Like I mean like that like initial thing, like you could totally just like instantiate a React app with Redux in it and then like do the actual it's called code producer like custom.
Yep. Where is this? There are like projects out there that just straight up set things up for you. See, look. This is a nice tool for setting up React Native apps. I usually use Flow. I do use Redux. These are two similar state management libraries out there. They do it in a different way, but they all like try to make state management easier. Pick Redux, React Native.
TypeScript is just like a library, right?
No, it's a language. It's a superset of JavaScript with like a lot of stuff added in to make it less like the Wild West that JavaScript is and more like a conventional language. Like it has typing built in. Flow is for typing as well. But Flow is an actual library that you just add in.
Okay.
So yes, we're like learning it step by step, but you will realize that even though there's a ton of boilerplate, Redux actually, after you do it a few times and get how it works, like you understand this flow chart that I'm building out, you just kind of copy paste the same boilerplate everywhere, and then it's not scary. Because you're like, oh, the only thing I really do is just write this part.
Right.
Because that's really where the only hard part about Redux is, writing this part, and maybe making like custom actions, right? Writing like more complicated actions.
So like, you can just think about, so right now we're just like pushing stuff up, right?
Hmm?
Like right up until this point, we're like we're just push stuff up, or we're just talking about like actually pushing stuff into state.
Yeah, right now we're just doing like an infinite loop of just changing the state without doing anything else.
Right.
It's not connected to React yet. So, for the people who weren't, yeah?
So when you get like a ton of actions, you usually put those in a separate file.
Oh yeah, I'll go into file organization a bit later, probably in the afternoon when we get far enough. But there's a whole section in the docs about file organization. Where is it? Code structure. There's like a whole page in the FAQ about this, and like I'll briefly go over it. There are a lot of ways to organize. There's no right way. So for everyone who didn't hear this explained, the reason why this is all caps with underscores is because it's supposed to be kind of like a constant. Constants just by convention are all caps with underscores. Just by, it's like naming. This could fully well be like a number or even like a Boolean. Right? Your type can be anything. It's just an object that you're sending in. Your action is just an object you're sending in. So your type could be anything. Make it a string so other people don't go insane looking at your code. Because if they see case true, they're going to think, what is going on here? And they won't understand anything. So strings that are descriptive, all caps with underscores. All right. So right now we're making changes to our state that's inside our store. We're not seeing anything happen outside of this, right? It's not connected to React yet. We also haven't done anything with this payload. So this was supposed to be something we delivered. So let's make something that actually gets delivered and makes a change in our state. So we're going to make a new action. This one is going to be of a new type, and it's actually going to use our payload. So it's going to be like set count. What do you think set count is going to do?
A new count.
Hmm?
New count.
Yep, a new count. It's going to set our count to something new. So let's say our payload is going to be like 10,000. When we dispatch this set count with a payload of 10,000, the thing I want to happen, so I'm going to copy this so I don't have to write it. The thing I want to happen is that it just sets that count directly to the number in the payload. So if I went like this, and I want to change count to whatever is in the payload, what would I write here?
Action.payload.
Yeah, action.payload. And a lot of your code is going to look like this. And if I go back now, it changes our count to 10,000. Payload can just be anything. You could also have a payload where it's not like a number directly. It could be an object with count inside of it. In which case, if you do this, what would I have to change here?
You get rid of the count, unwrap it, destruct it.
Oh, you mean like this? Oh, that works. I didn't think of that. This works. That totally works. That is crazy. You can do this. This is actually a very neat trick. I never actually thought of doing this. If you weren't going to do that though, what would you change about this to get that count? Oh, the value. It wouldn't be value though. What do we name it? Count, right? So like, it's like a stupid thing. I'm like asking a super simple question that sounds stupid, but a lot of people kind of just forget that you're just passing objects around and you just use them like normal objects. There's nothing crazy complicated. And you can do, if you're like really comfortable with JavaScript, yeah, you can do tricks like this and it works really well. So your reducer and your actions are going to be as clean as, like, the level of cleanliness is going to be about equal to the level of your JavaScript skills. So like, if you don't feel very confident in your JavaScript and you're like not great at it, your code might probably not look as clean. But if you look at really like, if you look at Dan Abramov's code, it's like super clean, and it's because he's just really good at JavaScript. And if you look at like actual projects out there, a lot of that looks super clean at first, and it's because, isn't because like they're super smart either, it's because they've probably like leveled themselves up and slowly cleaned up their code. So it's okay if your code looks like terrible stuff like this in the beginning. Eventually you'll learn a lot of tricks and pick them up, and your code will just get cleaner and cleaner. So don't be afraid to write this in the beginning, then eventually like know that you're gonna make this better. All right, so making changes to our store with dispatch, we're logging right after it. Before I like start connecting this to React, I'm gonna show off a crazy trick. So dispatch is a function, right? Dispatch is a function. So if I made a function called log dispatch with log, dispatch was a function that took in some action, right? Let's see if I remember how to do this correctly. Before dispatch. Dispatch. Oh man, can't remember the syntax for this. I'm trying to rewrite dispatch so it logs before it dispatches and logs after it. Because this is very much doable. I'm trying to remember the syntax though. I'm going to cheat and look at my notes. Where is this? This is why I cannot remember this. Oh, it's because I'm supposed to start with store. All right. I'm just going to explain the code to show that this is possible. I can't remember how to do this all the time. If you want to add logging to your dispatch, what you're going to do with your store.dispatch is you're going to set it equal to a custom dispatcher. You're just going to override it. Because you can do that, right? Dispatch is just like a key like on your store object, and you can just overwrite it with a new value. The new value is going to be the result from the return value of this add logging to dispatch. This is going to take in a store. It's going to look at our old dispatch, the original one, store.dispatch, that's what this is. It's going to return a new dispatch. Like this is a new dispatcher. Dispatch we know takes an action. So it's going to be a function that looks the same, takes in the same argument, but instead it's going to log some stuff beforehand, get the return value from dispatch, log some stuff after it, return that eventual value that came out of it. And if you do this, and we dispatch an action, you're going to see a crazy logging thing like this, where you have state being printed out beforehand and state being printed out afterwards. And then this was inside a reducer. This is this call here. So I'm only showing this off because like I don't want to keep logging after this, because it's very annoying to keep logging. But this is with Redux, because it's just pure JavaScript, you can make changes, any changes you want. Here, this is something that's in one of Dan Abramov's videos. He's using something called console.group. All console.group does is it takes in an argument for what the group name is. Every log statement that happens after it, up until group end, gets put inside of this. So you can open and close it. Right? And then he adds colorizing to this to make it go, oh, state before dispatch, state after dispatch. So you can see everything that's happening. And any logs that happen in like your reducer as well are in here, is in that group. So it's everything until group end. You can look at this. I'm going to link to the video because he explains this really well, what's happening. Look at this. You don't have to. Oh, why is it not default? Because some people don't want to see console logs everywhere. And there's a way to do this with middleware instead, which we get into in Mod 5. But for now, since I can't show middleware yet, I'm going to use this as my cheat to like log everything I'm doing now. Play around with this. Do whatever you want in here. You can log a ton of stuff in here. Just don't overdo it. Everyone okay with this? Because I'm going to use this from now on. Cool? All right. So, we only have 7 minutes. All right. No, I want to go to the next slide. Cool. Quickly going through this slide. Read only. Don't change state. Actions are just plain objects. Type payload are conventions. You can add other stuff, just don't do it. Now that we've done dispatches, we know that we're not going to do a set state. We're not going to be like, set state, change our state. Instead, we're going to grab an action, dispatch it to our store. Store is going to change our state. And it's all done with a pure function. So one thing I'm going to say about this reducer is it's supposed to be a pure function. Don't put anything in here that triggers side effects. So possible side effects that you might think you want to do in here is like a fetch. Don't put your fetch in here. Like, you don't know if like the change you do from your fetch is going to happen the same way every time you do it. So even though your state looks the same, that fetch could be different. So that's like a side effect. Don't put, what's another like very common side effect that people do? Don't like do something crazy with the DOM in here, right? It's just JavaScript. You could like do like document.window.whatever. Don't do any of that in here. Just use pure JavaScript, just change your state. No side effects. Reducer, we saw now, is just a function, and it's just something with a giant switch statement that returns a new state. This is going to be, this is like the chart that's happening. Reducer, this is what I was building out here. The next part that we need to do now is connect this. Because if we remember the hierarchy slide, the next thing you need to do is connect it so it sends out changes, right? So, one, I'm going to change this to dot, dot, dot. That's your state. Remember that, not the word state. We're now going to do this connecting part. And to do that, we now have to use the React Redux library. Because now we're like not just doing Redux stuff. We want to use something that connects it to React. So we're going to import something from there. And this is going to be a magical thing that somehow gives gives our store to everyone. It's going to connect it and let us give it to everyone. What do you think it's going to be called? Store? Well, it's not going to be store because like we made a store here with create store. So it's not going to be a store. It's going to be something that that helps us give store to everyone.
It's a component, right?
Yeah, it's a component. So English, get state distribution. So store get state distribution. This one actually sounds decent. This one actually sounds good. It's very close to like something like this. It's called provider. It provides the store to everyone. What is the definition of provider in English?
Someone who gives.
Yeah, someone who gives. Our provider is someone who gives. And the thing they're giving is the store. And the way you use it is it's a component. Just like router, we're going to wrap our app with this. And it takes in just one prop. The prop is the store we created. And then it's going to let us get store everywhere. We only have 2 minutes, so I'm not going to show you how we get that. But this is where how we're going to provide it to them. If you do not have this wrapped around your app, once we try to grab stuff from the store, it's just not going to work because it won't know where the store is. Any questions about why this is named provider? No? Any questions about all this reducer stuff and dispatching and making changes?
That's definitely not the simplest way to do that. Like you get rid of all that.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna like clean this up. Like,
It'll be like 6 lines.
yeah. This is not gonna look like this later. So notice how Houdini now, because we're gonna start connecting this to Houdini. I've already reorganized Houdini into folders. No more crazy like everything in one folder. It's nice and neat. APIs are inside the API folder. Your assets are in your assets folder. Your components are all in the component folder. I don't have a containers folder yet because we don't really have that many containers, so I'm not going to do that. But we also have like our higher component folder. I also made a folder for tests, even though we never write them. But we have tests. So it's all going to be cleaned up. And we're now going to add folders. Like we're going to start adding folders for like Redux. Everyone good on what was covered this morning? We're going to continue this afternoon and like start connecting all the dots. Cool? Oh, so some of this, so the parts that I tend to keep inside index are just this. This one line, usually I leave inside index. Because I could put it in a folder called like store.js and then export store. I'm not going to do that. Not unless I have like a ton of crazy custom middleware that I need to like set up beforehand. And even then, it's like you might as well put it in index, because index is, so far we haven't put anything in index. Index is like the root of your application, so everyone goes there first to see what's happening to get set up. And this is just setup stuff. This is a setup. Any other questions? Cool. All right, cool. All right, that's it for this morning.